The Winter Festival at Fairmont Crest opened like a meticulously staged performance, with white bands of lights wrapped around the compound gates, reflecting off stone walls, gate pillars, and the polished road surface, making the place look like an icy fortress completely cut off from the outside world. One by one, luxury cars rolled silently through the iron gates, leaving the cold of the winter night behind and carrying inside the familiar faces of Fairmont Crest, people who knew one another all too well, who knew exactly how to smile politely, raise a glass in a toast, trade half-hearted hugs, but who had never stepped into an evening where the air was so tense that every breath felt like an unnecessary noise. They arrived in dazzling outfits, expensive perfume and carefully prepared words of congratulations, yet there was a hint of something else in their eyes, something like vigilance, like the restless anticipation of a storm hidden behind the sparkling backdrop of Winterfest. In the middle of the main square, flooded with light, Damone Roberts appeared like a flawless accent in this world of luxury, moving confidently among staff rushing to straighten flowers, check lighting, and adjust photo backdrops. He was the one the Dupree family had entrusted with turning Winterfest into an event without a single scratch, and he clearly did not disappoint them. Every bough, every fir branch, every lamppost Damone touched fell into exactly the right place, the right tone, the right spirit the Duprees wanted to project: sophistication, power, and an aura that demanded respect. The long tables draped in white cloth, the crystal-clear glasses, the deep green wreaths flecked with warm golden candlelight, all merged into a scene so perfect it almost felt cold. Yet the more perfect everything looked, the more visible the cracks beneath the surface became to anyone paying attention: glances that slid away too quickly, handshakes that were just a bit too tight, smiles that were held a second too long as if to cover something impatient to break free. Damone could make everything look impeccable, but even he could not hide the truth that tonight was not just a festival, but a stage for strategic moves no one was ready to admit out loud. When the background music softened and the lights converged on the stage, Anita stepped out with her familiar composure, her elegant gown embracing a figure that had somehow retained its regal grace despite countless storms. Her smile was gentle, honed through dozens of major events over her lifetime, but in her eyes there was a determination that her closest circle recognized immediately. They knew Anita never wasted a public appearance. Every word she spoke was another brick laid on the long road she had been building for the Dupree family. When she began to speak, her voice carried smoothly over the sound system, without the slightest tremor, sounding at first like just another part of the evening's formalities. But the content of her announcement made everything in the hall seem to freeze. She referred to the family fortune, to the restructuring of power, to a turning-point decision involving the person who would take on a role capable of altering the Dupree family's structure forever. There was nothing overtly dramatic in her words, but the weight hidden in them was enough to send several gazes skittering, enough to make a few glasses tremble in their owners' hands. Without naming anyone, she made it clear that from this moment forward, no one's place in the power hierarchy was as secure as it had been. Applause followed, but it was far from the carefree enthusiasm usually heard at Fairmont Crest parties. These were clipped claps, at once respectful and hesitant, as though everyone were trying to buy themselves a little time to rearrange their thoughts. Amid that shifting wave of reaction, Jacob did not immediately blend into the clusters of people beginning to whisper and speculate. He stepped back, watching his family's reactions and those of the compound's key players with a clarity that few could maintain in such a turbulent moment. Then, almost at once, he moved, cutting through the rings of guests to reach his older brother. Without waiting for the party to slide into more public theatrics, Jacob quietly pulled his brother aside, steering him toward a corner out of the line of prying eyes, where music and laughter dulled, leaving enough silence to clearly hear the pounding of one's own heart. The warning Jacob gave was not a complaint, and even less an impulsive reaction to Anita's announcement. It was the product of long observation, of puzzle pieces he had quietly gathered over many months. He spoke of a counterstrike that had been carefully prepared, a plan lying beyond the control of those who thought tonight belonged solely to the Duprees. Jacob hinted that not everyone present under the glittering dome of lights had come with the simple intention of offering congratulations. Some had brought smiles, bouquets and toasts, but inside they carried knives already sharpened, just waiting for the moment Anita opened the door to power to lunge forward. He did not name names, did not point fingers, but the gravity in his tone made it impossible to dismiss this as mere paranoia. In the grand tableau of Winterfest, Jacob stood as one of the few willing to look squarely at the darkness shifting behind the backdrop and to tell his brother, whom he still respected, that they no longer had the luxury of being complacent. While warnings and calculations slipped quietly from one corner of the event to another, the flow of people continued to drift around the neatly arranged tables. Evening gowns brushed lightly across the tile floor, wine glasses rose and fell, and bursts of laughter rang out just loud enough to sustain the illusion that everything remained under control. Yet in the midst of this seemingly placid surface, Leslie chose to root herself in a single goal, as though all the power games had become secondary to a desire she had carried inside for years. She did not remain close to the stage to catch every word of Anita's announcement, nor did she angle for gossip by leaning in close to anyone's ear. Instead, Leslie threw herself into arranging, coordinating and adjusting every detail of one moment she believed her daughter deserved. A complete evening beside the father the girl had always lacked, a man she had heard about more than she had ever truly been allowed to stand beside. Every decision Leslie made that night was a compromise with the stubborn pride she had spent years building up. To ensure her daughter would have the chance to stand next to her father without being scrutinized, dragged into arguments or pulled into behind-the-scenes scheming, she had to accept terms she had once sworn never to agree to. She allowed herself to sit at tables she used to avoid looking at, shook hands with people she had long considered adversaries, and even listened to their suggestions about seating arrangements, timing, and photo angles for her child. Each nod was like a small fracture in the cold shell Leslie had wrapped around herself as a shield against Fairmont Crest. But she accepted each one, because in this rare moment, what she wanted was not to win some simmering adult battle, but to see her daughter's face light up beside the father she had, in Leslie's eyes, been unfairly distanced from. To the hazy music of Winterfest, Leslie realized that some battles are not measured in power or status, but in the smile of a child who, for once, feels she is no longer being left on the sidelines. Yet allowing herself to slip into a more yielding position did not weaken Leslie. It merely transformed her pride into another kind of energy, quieter, more enduring. She watched every expression, every look around her, committing them to memory like strategic data. She knew that those who were willing to extend a hand tonight might just as easily turn their backs tomorrow, but that mattered less than the fact that, for this one evening, they had contributed, however reluctantly, to the moment she was trying to protect for her daughter. Amid whispers about Anita's decision to redistribute the family fortune, amid quick glances calculating who would be elevated and who might be pushed aside, Leslie seemed to move on a different current, one in which her only concern was whether her daughter would leave the event that night carrying the memory of a warm hand in hers or yet another hollow gap stacked on top of too many past absences. In another corner of the celebration, where the lights were softer and the music had receded into the background, Tomas had just experienced a moment he wanted to erase as soon as it happened. His encounter with Ted had not been loud, with no barbed words to draw attention, but the awkwardness in every gesture, every nod, every polite smile was enough to thicken the air around them. To Tomas, Ted was not merely another man within the boundaries of Fairmont Crest. He was a living reminder of the fragile lines Tomas had been treading, of the choices he had made, was making, and might have to pay for. When their eyes accidentally met amid the low murmur of surrounding conversations, Tomas felt his heart skip, not because of anything Ted said, but because of what they both knew and refused to say. Unable to bear the tightening ring of formality and discomfort, Tomas chose to leave the crowd. He stepped out of the bright center of the square while others were still absorbed in the night's hottest topics, Anita's announcement, the Dupree family's reactions, the hidden alliances everyone was trying to guess at, and let the music and laughter fade behind him. In the quieter hallway, where the light softened and the cold air seeped in more clearly, Tomas finally felt the chaos surging within him. It was as if he stood at a crossroads, both paths leading into territories he was not sure he was ready to face. And at the very center of this intersection, only one name appeared distinctly in his mind, Kat. For a long time, Tomas had known that the bond between him and Kat was more than fleeting attraction in a compound full of brief, superficial affairs. Her gaze, the way she had taken his side when it seemed everyone else had turned away, and the quiet stretches of time that needed no words yet made him feel less alone, all of that had woven itself into the inner life he showed to almost no one. But on this Winterfest night, with Anita's announcement appending the balance of power and figures like Ted still standing like boulders in his path, Tomas was forced to admit he could no longer drift along on vague feelings. There was a question that had smoldered in him for a long time, one he had tried to ignore, hoping that time would somehow deliver an answer. Tonight, under the pressure of Winterfest's atmosphere, that question refused to stay in the shadows any longer. It flared up, burning away the last remnants of his hesitation. It was a question he could not address to anyone but Kat, a question that might pull her toward him or push her irrevocably away, one that would compel them both to confront what they truly wanted and how much they were willing to sacrifice in a family like the Duprees, where love rarely exists apart from loyalty and the chains of power. Tomas understood that the words he was about to speak, if he could summon the courage to utter them, would not merely mark a step in their relationship, but could also reshape the way he was perceived within the larger story unfolding at Fairmont Crest. If Kat accepted, they would face storms he knew would be anything but gentle. If she refused, he would lose the only anchor he had held on to in these calculating days. That awareness made each step he took down the hallway heavier, yet strangely more certain. He no longer wanted to run from what his heart had already decided. While the cold white lights of Winterfest continued to dance across the surface of the decorative lake, reflecting off the faces laughing in the distance, no one realized that in the quieter corners of Fairmont Crest, silent choices were being made that carried just as much weight as the announcements echoing through the hall. Anita had dropped a stone into the once still waters of the Dupree family with her declaration, sending ripples outward that touched everyone, from those at the top of the hierarchy to those who had always seemed like background figures. Jacob chose the role of the one who sees further, willing to be the one who spoils the fun to remind everyone that behind the lights lay a darkness yet unnamed. Leslie quietly chipped away at her own armor, not for the sake of any adult in this world, but for the eyes of a child who had always felt herself standing at the edge. And Tomas, after one stiff, uncomfortable encounter with Ted, recognized that he could no longer stand in the middle and that the time had come to turn the burning question in his chest into words for Kat. Thus Winterfest, with all the splendor Damone Roberts had painstakingly orchestrated, became far more than a simple winter celebration. It was a velvet curtain drawn over hidden schemes, a backdrop for decisions that would redefine the Dupree family and relationships that had once seemed strictly private but were now being dragged into the vortex of wealth, power, and honor. The night might eventually end with the last song, guests leaving, lights going out and the gates of Fairmont Crest closing once more as if they had never opened to the world's gaze. But what Anita had said, what Jacob had warned, the compromises Leslie had accepted and the question Tomas was carrying for Kat would not vanish with the lights. They would live on, stirring the waters, turning Winterfest into a point of no return for love, loyalty, and the future of the Duprees, just as so many nights that seem meant only for celebration secretly mark the moments that change an entire life. Thank you all for your loyal support and listening.